Okay, here we go. The name of the parsha Vayishlach means "and he sent," and it is found in Genesis chapter 32. Jacob returns to the Holy Land after a 20-year stay in Haran and sends angel emissaries to Esau, to his brother, to Esav, in hopes for reconciliation. So it's funny, the verse says, here they translate angel emissaries. The word in Hebrew is malachim. Malachim is a tricky word because malachim is the same word, could be either angels or emissaries, because essentially an angel is an emissary. So there are two interpretations. If he sent angels, if you want to be more mystical, Rashi quotes that, or he sent messengers. Either way, the messengers report that his brother is on the warpath with 400 armed men. Now, warpath is translation. That's commentary. That's not what the verse says. The verse says, "We came to your brother, and he's coming toward you with 400 men." Now Jacob is afraid. He's frightened. So he's afraid his brother's coming for war. Now I'm just pointing that out because it's not at all clear that Esav was coming for war, right? He has his clan and he has his band of people, and wherever they go, they go. But it doesn't necessarily mean he's coming for war. Just to point that out. So Jacob is frightened. What does he do? Jacob prepares for war, prays, and sends Esav a large gift consisting of hundreds of heads of livestock to appease him. Right? So he diversifies his efforts. He doesn't, he first of all, he separates, he does both praying to God. In other words, finding a spiritual cure, praying to God, but also takes physical measures to protect himself. So that's two different avenues. And within the physical measures, he diversifies. He says, I'm going to prepare for war, but also send gifts for peace. So he does both of those. That night, Jacob ferries his family and possessions across the Jabbok River. He, however, remains behind and encounters the angel that embodies the spirit of Esav, and who he wrestles until daybreak. Jacob suffers a dislocated hip, but vanquishes the supernal creature, who bestows on him the name Israel, which means he who prevails over the divine. Okay, this is probably one of the most mysterious scenes, certainly the most mysterious scene in the book of Genesis. I would say one of the most mysterious scenes in the entire Torah. And we'll talk a little bit about why it's so mysterious and why it's so strange. And hopefully we can give some commentary. So that's one of the stories I want to focus on today. In any case, he's got his name change. Now he's going to go meet Esav. Jacob and Esav meet, embrace, and kiss, but part ways. Jacob purchases, so that's the meeting. And now sort of that's part of the story is completed. Now we have sort of the peace, or I don't say peace, but the circle is closed. The circle of relationship between Jacob and his twin brother Esav. He stole the blessings. He was away for 20 years. He comes back. They embrace. They part ways. They live happily ever after. They're done, at least from the perspective of the Bible. Later on, at least for the perspective of this family. Later on, when the Jews leave Egypt, it flares up again, but that's another story. Now we talk about Jacob is back in Israel, and now he tries to settle in the land of Israel. But the settling in the land of Israel does not come without challenges. And the first challenge is the abduction and rape of Dinah, his daughter. Jacob journeys on. Rachel dies while giving birth to her second son, Benjamin. Benjamin means the son. Ben Yamin, son of the right side. That's part of that according to Rashi is a reference to the fact that Benjamin is the only one of the 12 tribes actually born in the land of Israel. In any case, Rachel dies. She's buried on the roadside grave near Beit Lechem. Right? She was not brought to the ancestral burial plot, which was in Hebron, which is about, I would say, 40, 50 kilometers away. She's buried on the road. You can go there today. It's not so easy. Oh, yeah, you can go there today. I've been there multiple times. Okay, Reuben loses the birthright because he interferes with his father's marital life. Jacob arrives in Hebron to his father Isaac, who later dies at age 180. Rebekah has passed away before Jacob's arrival. Our parasha concludes with a detailed account of Esav's wives, children, and grandchildren, the family histories of the people of Seir, among whom Esav settled, and a list of the 8 kings who ruled Edom, the land of Esav, the land of Esav and Seir's descendants. So the end of the parsha, we give you all the information. Today they say you have too much information. What TMI, an acronym for too much information. So we almost have too much information about Esav. And the reason why we have all this information is because this is the closing. This part of the story, Esav, we're done with Esav. We finish the story of Esav. We give you all the information you need for the next multiple generations, and then we turn the focus to the real story, the story of Jacob and Jacob's descendants. So that is the parsha in a nutshell. There's a lot to say about this parsha. We'll try to give a few of the general mystical points, and then maybe we'll do a little bit of analysis inside of the verses, especially that's seen of Jacob meeting his brother, and before that, Jacob meeting the angel. So that's the roadmap for today. If anybody has comments or questions, or you want to direct me to a certain perspective or direction, that's good. Otherwise, we continue. So the first, if you want to look at the story from the perspective of the Kabbalah, and we're middle of the JLI on the Kabbalah, so Vicky was there, so we talked about this concept of chaos and order at great length on Tuesday. So I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's very important to understand the story of Jacob and Esav from the perspective of the Kabbalah cannot be understood without understanding the concepts of order and chaos. So in short, let's just go back a little bit and get the big picture here. We have 2 twins, and the fact that they're twins is actually very strange, that one is sort of chosen and becomes part of the patriarch of the Jewish people, and the other one sort of drifts away. And not only is he not part of the Jewish people, but from the perspective of the sages, we could talk about it later, but at the end of the parsha, when you list the descendants of Esav, one of the descendants is Kittim, and the sages say Kittim is Rome. From the perspective of the Torah, at least the sages of the Mishnah, the Medrash, Rome is a descendant of Esav, either a literal descendant or a figurative descendant, and then, in other words, they embody Esav's values. But either way, from the perspective of the sages, in some ways, Jacob and Esav are in conflict, because in the days of the Talmudic sages of the Mishnah, Rome destroyed the temple and they destroyed Israel, and for many for certain periods of time they outlawed Judaism. So the conflict between Israel and Rome, in their perspective, is also the conflict between Jacob and Esav. If you go back to the beginning of the story, where Rebecca was pregnant and she has twins, and the pregnancy is difficult, she goes to the prophet, and the prophet tells her that there are 2 nations in your womb, and each one will try to overpower the other. In other words, there's going to be an ongoing struggle between these 2 twins, which is a strange thing, because they're twins. They should be connected. They should be connected at the source, so to speak. How are they so divergent, right? If you go to the generation before, you have Isaac and Yishmael. Ishmael becomes the father of Arabia and later perhaps Islam. And then you have Isaac, and Isaac is part of the Jewish people, Ishmael is not. Okay, that's not such a difficult thing to understand. Why not? Because although they share the same father, who you have is which is Abraham, they have 2 different mothers. And Sarah was partnered with Abraham in her belief system. She preached monotheism with her husband, etc., etc. And Rebecca and Hagar is a Egyptian maidservant. She was actually an idol worshiper. After the Torah describes how she left her father's Abraham's home and she gets lost in the desert, the Medrash says she gets lost, meaning figuratively as well. She goes back to her pagan ways. Later on, according to the Medrash, Abraham marries her again. But the point here is it's 2 different mothers coming from 2 different cultures. So it's one is the descendant of Shem, one descendant of Ham. So it's not really a question of how they diverge so dramatically. But here you have 2 twins, same father, same mother, the children of 2 righteous people. And here you have this divergence between Esav and Jacob. How does this happen? And then we continue to the wonder continues, which was 2 weeks ago. And 2 weeks ago we read how the father wants to bless Esav, the older one. The conventional interpretation is because the father is in a way blinded to his son. He doesn't realize that his son is not on par with his spiritual message, and because his son tricked him. That's the conventional reading of the story. And Rebecca loves the younger one, and the father wants to bless the older one. And then what happens? The younger one steals the blessing from the older one, and then ultimately now they make peace. Okay, what's really happening here? So from the perspective of the Kabbalah, you have what the doctrine of what they call the world of chaos and the world of order. And what the Kabbalah says is absolutely fascinating, and there are tremendous ramifications for this idea. But the idea is like this. The world of holiness as we know it is the second world. It's the world that we call the world of order. Before the world of order is what we call the world of chaos. The world of chaos, there's tremendous amount of energy, holy energy. And because the energy there is so profound and so intense, the various forces cannot coexist. And because of the intense holiness, they crash, they clash, and they fall very low. And just think about the imagery. So they have very intense light, falls very low. And the unholiness and the negativity that we perceive in this world is negative because it's fell, so it's disconnected from its source, but really it possesses a tremendous amount of energy because its source is very high, which explains why in this world, when we look around, often what we see is that negativity and the drive for negativity could be more powerful than the drive for holiness, right? We all know there's a godly soul, there's an animal soul, there's the good inclination, there's the evil inclination. I'm going to talk for myself. The animal soul seems to be much more powerful, much more persistent, right? Just because I want to do something good, it doesn't mean I'm going to do it. It depends if it's cold outside, if I'm motivated, if I drink enough caffeine. But if it's something all of a sudden that the negative soul wants, that the animal soul wants, there is no stopping. Often we feel like there's nothing stopping me because the animal side of the human being seems to be much, much more powerful. And also, if you look in the world, what's more powerful in the world? The forces of negativity and positivity. Unfortunately, it seems that in the world, the forces of negativity are much more powerful. So how does this work? So again, the doctrine of the breaking of the vessels. You have intense energies in holiness. They're too intense, they crash, they fall. When they fall down, they have a tremendous amount of passion, but they are misguided. And if they're misguided, they is what we call negativity, and therefore in some ways they're dangerous, and therefore we try to stay away from it in some ways. What is the goal of our life on this earth according to the Kabbalah? So you heard of the term tikkun olam, to correct the world, which today comes to mean as social justice, which is a fine endeavor. I'm nothing against social justice, but the origin of the concept is in the Kabbalah. And in the Kabbalah, in the context of the broken vessels, what do? We have to now collect the broken vessels. We have to bring them together again and channel them back to holiness. When I do so, the intense energy of the world of chaos is channeled in the world of order, and then I have both advantages. And when I do that within myself, that's peace and harmony within myself. When collectively humanity will do that in an entire world, that's peace and harmony in the world, and that's the Messianic era. That's when the world reaches perfection. So there's many ways to talk about it, and there's many applications of this, but a very simple application. You look within the self, even though it's not exactly the same, but a very similar concept happens with the mind and the heart, where the mind is supposed to be, at its best, analytical. And because it's analytical, it tries to break everything down. And therefore, when you get excited, your mind says, take it easy. And it works both ways. So if, let's say, for example, something bad happens. What happens? Something bad happens. You hear that something bad happens. I don't know. What's bad happens to people? I don't know. Something bad happens. So the mind says, take it easy. It's not so bad. Maybe this is bad. Maybe something good will come out of it. Yes, you wanted to go to the concert. It was canceled. But now you have time to stay home. Now you can go to the restaurant. So the mind, because it's analytical, it constantly mitigates the emotion. Now the emotion, now it happens the other way around. If I get something very good that happens, I'm so excited. You give a kid an ice cream, and the kid is so excited. When you give an adult an ice cream, say, okay, it's fine, it's tasty, but I know it's only going to last a few moments, and I know it has health, but it's also not good for me, too many calories, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, the more mind you have, the more the mind turns down the passion of the heart. Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, it's not all good, right? Some people are so intellectual, they can't bring any passion to life. So there's the mind and the heart, and the mind is always breaking things down and therefore analyzing and therefore losing the passion. The passion is very different when the heart wants something and wants something completely. I always say that if I tell you that I love you 96.5%, you know that my heart is not talking, my mind is talking. I'm analyzing, I'm not speaking emotion. So emotion is passionate, but sometimes, very often, it could be misdirected. The mind, objectively, the mind at its best is objective. It can find the better path, but it loses some of the passion. What's the best way to live? The best way to live is not to suppress and destroy the heart, the passion, but to direct it. So you have the negative passion. Could you move it to positive passion? Could you move it to passion for something good? And essentially, that's what we say here. The heart has a higher source. Its source within the soul is much more powerful. That's what it has more emotion, much more power. It fell lower than the mind. So in some sense, it's misguided. I look for my heart's desires. I know I want comfort. I know I want pleasure. But sometimes I don't know where to look for it. I look for it in destructive places. So that's the broken, shattered vessels. And then what you have to do is you have to really use your mind, not to destroy the heart, but to channel the heart. And like I said, if you do it within yourself, you brought peace and harmony to your life to some degree. And we can't do it completely, but to some degree. And if you do that in the world, you're taking the passion of the negativity and directing it to the positive. Think about this. The most destructive people in the world, in some sense, are very, very, very talented and very charismatic, right? If they weren't that charismatic, they couldn't cause that much damage. What happens if some of that charisma would be channeled for holiness? What happens if some of the energy that people use for self-oriented purposes would now be directed for transcendent purposes? Okay, then the world reaches perfection. So in other words, that's the big story here that covers my own life, but also the entire history. Now come back to this story. Come back to the story of Yaakov and Esav. Says the Kabbalah, Yaakov is order, Esav is passion, is chaos. Chaos has a very bright source, but in the application, it's not always positive. And therefore, while Yaakov is sitting in the tent studying, because he's calm, he could sit straight, he has time to study. Esav can't sit straight, he's got to run around and hunt. So this is a sort of chaotic energy. Now, Jacob is an intensely spiritual person, the father. So why does Jacob want to bless the hunter instead of the scholar? Presumably, Jacob is a spiritual person. He wants to bless the scholar, not the hunter. You would think he should bless the scholar, not the hunter. The answer is no, the opposite. Because Jacob is so spiritually attuned, when he sees the chaos, he doesn't see the chaos as it presents itself in the negative form in this world. He sees the source of the chaos. And the source of the chaos is holy. And the energy of the chaos is positive. And he says, you know what? Let's bless the chaos. Let's bless Esav. So Esav will be able to reach a greater potential. Now, Rebecca, the mother, says, no, that doesn't really work that way. Because when the child is chaotic or the heart is chaotic, if you bless it, if you give it more energy, all you're doing is creating more chaos. You need the world of order to channel the world of chaos. You need the mind to channel the heart. You need Judea. You need the Jewish people to help Rome, to help Western civilization direct its power and potential and brilliance and technology to something positive. So Rebecca says you have to bless Jacob, not because you want to bless Jacob. You have to bless Jacob so that Jacob can elevate Esav. And that's essentially what's happening in the story. That explains a lot about the story once we start getting into the details. It also represents that in some way, the kiss, the embrace of Jacob and Esav is a taste of what's going to happen in the end of times. The end of times, it's when Western culture and Judaism embrace. Right now, they're in some way at a conflict. In other words, not the culture. Of course, Western culture is based on Christianity, based on Judaism. But I'm saying the ambition of the science of technology is not necessarily spiritually oriented. But that's Esav. But then the point is, could Jacob and Esav embrace? And now the science of technology is now serving a higher purpose, spiritual purpose, which is represented by Jacob. By the way, a beautiful thing in the Haftorah of this week's Parsha, we read the prophet Ovadia, and Ovadia is a descendant, a convert from Edom. He's a convert from Esav. and he talks about the problems with Esav. But the conclusion of that Haftorah, we say it every day in the prayer, is that at the end of days, when Mashiach comes, people from Mount Zion, from Jerusalem, will go to Mount Seir, which is where Esav was. And then the concluding verse is the second clause: people from Mount Zion will go to Mount Seir, and then then God will reign king in the world. In other words, you can't have God reign king in the world. You can't have the world reach perfection until Jacob and Esav make peace, until Jerusalem and Rome make peace, until Western civilization and Judaism are not in conflict, but they're actually helping each other. So that's the big picture. A lot to talk about this. It has many ramifications. We could talk about this for a long time, but comments or questions welcome. Then we'll start looking at certain episodes of the Parsha, especially the angel. It's very interesting, I think. And then we could talk about that as well. But that's just this is the big idea. The big idea of the Kabbalah on Jacob and Esav is the world of order and world of chaos. Like I said, I'm giving a little bit of a taste. There's a lot more to say, a lot of literature on this. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Quick question. You mentioned that at the Haftorah, one of the brothers come to another brother, and you said the Zion comes to Seir. Is that the order that it envisioned? That's the order that the reconciliation should happen at the end?
I don't know if I don't know how much of it is poetry and how much of it is has to be that way, because sometimes the connection is explained other ways, right? You look at the other kingdoms that come to Jerusalem, but okay, the truth of the matter is that I'm romanticizing it a little bit. That verse talks about the Olam Moshiach, there'll be people from Mount Seir, from Mount Zion, to go to Mount Seir. I wasn't completely honest. I withheld some piece of information. Lishpot is Har Esav, to judge the mountain of the mountain of Esav, to judge. Now, to judge could sound like they're coming. Esav is bad, and we have to come and we have to judge them. But judge doesn't have to mean that. Judge would mean also to clarify what aspects of Esav are good and elevate those aspects. So because over there, it's more like, in that image, it's more like judgment. So judgment emerges from Jerusalem. So yes, when we talk about Mount Seir, we talk Mount Esav, we talk about Esav, we talk about the world of chaos. The world of chaos has to be directed by the world of order. The heart has to be directed by the mind. So in that sense, the mind is taking the lead. But again, the mind taking the lead does not mean that the heart doesn't have many advantages over the mind. And we talked about that. There's a very famous, there's a verse that the Kabbalah always quotes, and it comes from King Solomon's book of Proverbs. There is much grain from the power of the ox. In other words, the ox is stronger than the human being. The human being cannot plow the field. The ox can plow the field, but a human has to channel the ox's energy to plow the field, right? So think about this. We talk about the mitzvah to love God. So the verse says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. The sages say all your heart is spelled with all your heart. It's spelled with another vet. It also says all your heart. Says the Mishnah, it means with both inclinations, with your good inclination, with your bad inclination. And what the commentaries explain is it's not just that we need the bad inclination to love God as well. Instead of loving chocolate cake, it should love God. It's much more than that. It's the negative sides. Love is much more powerful. So the animal soul has to teach the godly soul how to love and how to be passionate, because the godly soul is too intellectual to be passionate. So the godly soul teaches the animal soul how to love God, how to understand the beauty of God, the beauty of holiness, the beauty of transcendence, and how to love that. But on the other hand, the animal soul teaches the godly soul how to love, how to be passionate. So it works both ways.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to look at one of the stories just because We don't always get this far in the story. We'll read the story of Jacob meeting the angel. We'll read what it says. We'll see what happens. We'll see if we can get any commentary on this or any meaning. I mean, there was plenty of meaning. Question is if we can discover it. Okay, so Jacob, what he does is he sends gifts to his brother, and the Torah gives you he prayed in the first reading, and then he has beautiful prayer, and he prays to God, and then he prepares for war. He divides his camp into two, and he says if one camp is struck, the other camp would survive, and then he comes to the point where he sends the gifts, and it gives you an exact amount of cattle he sends and camels, etc. And then he goes to sleep. Okay, verse 22. So the gift passed on before him, and he lodged that night in the camp. By Yalan, he camped that night. He lodged that night in the camp. Now you think he's going to go to sleep. Now the strangest thing happens. He gets up, and he arose during that night, and he took his 2 wives and his 2 maidservants and his 11 children, and he crossed the ford of the Yabok. There's a Yabok is a Yabok river. It's an offshoot of the Jordan. But if the Jordan goes from north to south, the Yabok goes from west to east. So it's east of the Jordan, in current day Jordan. So Jacob is presumably he's traveling south, and he gets up another night and crosses the Jordan and crosses Yabok. Now a very strange thing happens. First of all, why is he getting up in the middle of the night to travel and to cross the river? It's just a strange thing. But in any case, verse 25, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the break of dawn. Now, a man wrestled with Jacob. First of all, why is he alone? But he's alone. We have to deal with why he's alone. He has his whole family there, but he's alone. And then a man wrestles with him till the morning. Now, it says a man. I'm going to give you the spoiler alert. The sages believe he's an angel. Why do they say so? Because later, Jacob refers to him as God. So bear with me. Right now, I don't know that Jacob knows that he's an angel. Jacob now sees that this guy's a man. He's wrestling with a man all night. When he saw, verse 26, when he saw that he could not prevail against him, meaning the man, this mysterious guy, sees that he can't overpower Jacob, he touched the socket of his hip, and the socket of Jacob's hip became dislocated as he wrestled with him. So Jacob survives, but now he's wrestling, but now he's limping because his socket of his hip becomes dislocated. And now in the bracket, they say the angel. I'm not sure that's the case. I mean, that's the conventional reading, but there are other readings. And he said, let me go, for dawn is breaking. But Jacob said, I will not let you go unless you have blessed me. So at some point, Jacob realizes this guy. Now, Jacob says this guy must be an extraordinary guy, because if a guy catches you in the alley and wrestles with you all night, the morning comes, and the guy says, let me go, you let him go. You don't ask him for a blessing. But in any case, Jacob realizes he's not an ordinary person. The guy turns to Jacob and he says, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be called Jacob, but Israel, because you have commanding power. The word Yisrael is Yisar. The word Sar is minister. You ministered, you have commanding power over an angel of God. They put angel in bracket, literally with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Jacob asked him his name. And Jacob asked that and said, now tell me your name. And he said, why is that you asked for my name? And he blessed him there. Talk about that later. There's no names. Give me just 1 second. And the morning you see, and Jacob named the place Peniel, literally the face of God. For he said, I saw an angel face to face, and my soul was saved. And the sun rose for him when he passed Penuel, and he was limping on his thigh. Therefore, and this is almost one of the most strange verses, therefore the children of Israel may not eat the displaced tendon, which is on the socket of the hip, until this day. For he touched the socket of Jacob's hip in the hip sinew. So I'm not exactly sure which sinew it is, but if you're going to buy kosher meat, we're not allowed to eat the sinew that's by the hip of the animal. Why? Because 3,400 years ago, the angel touched Jacob's hip, and he was limping, and therefore we're not going to eat any hip. when we eat the sinew of the hip when we eat meat. If that makes sense to you, I'm very jealous of you. But okay, we'll have to talk about that. Go ahead, doctor, please.
Two questions. One, Rabbi, as you've taught us, this begins with Jacob, I guess, holding on to Esau's heel. Then we have here a story about the angel holding on to his hip. Do the commentators talk specifically about these two body parts, about the whole idea of holding on to the body, etc., as being relevant in terms of Kabbalah or in terms of Jewish history?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes. Certainly about let's deal with the sinew, with the hip. The hip for one moment. Let's start with the hip. Right? It's a strange story. Why is it a strange story? Because since when are you wrestling with an angel? What is really happening here? It's a strange story. But what's also strange about the story is, imagine we want to make, for whatever reason, okay, let's start from the beginning. Am I making a mistake here? Are there three? The book of Genesis is not a book of commandments, right? There's very few commandments in the book of Genesis. Depending on how you count, I think there are 4 commandments in the book of Genesis. There is be fruitful and multiply, procreation, assuming that's a mitzvah. That's a mitzvah, so let's count that. There is circumcision, and there's not eating the sinew of the hip. There's a 4th one, Shabbat is mentioned, but it's not really here. It's really in Exodus. Okay, so there's very, very few commandments in the book of Genesis. This is one of them. Now, if you say one of 613 commandments, it's okay, you could have some commandments that are about details. But if you talk about commemorating the lives of the patriarchs, many things happen in the life of the patriarchs. Most things do not have a mitzvah commemorating them. This is an exception. Here there's a mitzvah commemorating the fact that on one night when Jacob was crossing the Jabbok River, he met a guy and they fought, and he got the sinew touched, and then he limped, and in the morning he was healed. It's like, is that so important for Jacob's life and for all of Jewish history to remember that event? And you're making a mitzvah, and you're saying that we don't eat the meat. Every time you go to the butcher, you're going to remember this story because you say, oh, sorry, I can't have that piece of meat. So obviously, there's symbolism here. Obviously, it's not just that night. Obviously, there's a greater story. And the question is what the greater story is. And we're going to do, like the doctor mentioned, we'll talk about both aspects. First, we'll start with the historic perspective from the commentaries that like to think about the history. And then we'll talk more about the spiritual perspective, and therefore the personal perspective, because if it's spiritual, it's related to each of us. Okay. Having made that introduction, let me make you one more introduction. If you want to commemorate the story about Jacob struggling with the man, with the angel, or with God, and overcoming and surviving. In other words, you want to tell a story of survival. So pick something that is celebratory about the story. Pick something that is triumphant about the story. Do something to commemorate that he survived the angel. Instead, what we do is we pick something that shows how he was vulnerable, how even after he overcame the angel, he's limping. In other words, he did not emerge unscathed. So why highlight the negative aspect of the story? That is the questions that we want to address, introductory questions to make the bigger points. So if anybody wants to say anything about this, please tell me, because I don't want to be the only one talking. If you have any ideas, don't be afraid to get creative. Please share. Otherwise, I'll have to tell you what I think, but what you think may be more exciting. Okay, so we'll start. So at any point, don't hesitate to jump in. We start with Nachmanides. Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman. Nachmanides, 13th century commentator and Kabbalist and commentator. And we always talk about this, but he has a consistent view of the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah. His interpretation based on the Medrash is that almost every story that happens in the book of Genesis is not just talking about the patriarchs, it's really telling about the future history of the Jewish people. So if Abraham has to descend to Egypt in the book of Genesis, it's because the Jewish people go to Egypt. If Abraham and Sarah ascend from Egypt, it's because the Jewish people later are going to ascend from Egypt. In other words, everything that happens to the patriarchs is going to happen to the children. That's his view of the story. Okay, so now if you're putting on those historic glasses and you're Nachmanides, now where's Nachmanides living? Nachmanides is living in Western Europe, Christian Europe, under, in some circumstances, very severe persecution after the Crusades, or between the Crusades, after the first and second, between the third, I think. And there's tremendous persecution against the Jewish people. The Jewish people are being persecuted. I don't want to get graphic here. They're getting slaughtered, etc. Okay, now you're Nachmanides. Now you're putting on the glasses and say, how can I read this story with the historical perspective? We have Jacob, we have Esav. The rabbis believe that when it says...
Who's calling?
The rabbis believe that when it says that it was the angel, it means the angel of Esav. And again, I already told you that they believe that Esav is the father of Rome, which is the father of Western Europe, of Europe. So Nachmanides says the story is like this. The story is Jacob is fighting all night long. The night represents the night of exile. The night of exile, there's going to be a struggle between Rome, the descendants of Esav, Western Europe, persecuting the Jewish people. That's that story. The good news is we're going to survive. The bad news is it's not going to be without pain. And therefore, in the end of the generations, that's sort of the sinew of the foot. The foot represents the end of the generations. It's the end of the anatomy, sort of outside of the torso. That's the end of days. Nachmanides talked about this in the 13th century, where, of course, a little later, when we had the Holocaust, etc. But he basically says, in the end of days, we are going to survive, yes, but there's going to be a tremendous amount of persecution on the way. And that's what we want to remember. And we want to highlight the persecution to show us that even during the persecution, don't worry, Jacob was also persecuted. Jacob was also affected negatively. He survived. We too will survive as a people. So that's how you read the story from the historical perspective. We have 5 minutes left, and I want to read the story from the personal, spiritual perspective. And in that sense, it could be relevant to each of us, even each and every one of us, even more than just the collective Jewish history. Okay, what is the story? The angel struck. Okay, let's stop for a second. Let's go back for a second. Why is the guy getting up middle of the night crossing the Yabok? Now, the conventional interpretation is he crosses the Yabok because he's going from north to south and he's getting closer to his brother. But that's a very strange analysis because he's afraid of his brother. Why would he want to approach his brother middle of the night? Why would he want to cross the river middle of the night, which is a very risky thing? Why is he doing this? So there is a commentary, the Rashbam, which is the descendant of Rashi, grandson of Rashi, and he has a very creative commentary. He says he wasn't moving toward Esav like everybody else thinks he was. What he was doing, he was running away from Esav. He gets up with his family in the middle of the night because he's trying to escape his brother. He doesn't want to confront his brother. And then God sends the angel to wrestle with him, and God tells him, you can't run away from the challenge. You have to meet your brother, you have to look him in the eye, and you have to deal with it. You have to face the challenge. And he doesn't want to face the challenge. He's trying to run away. And part of the story is that if you have to face the challenge, it may take a toll on you. It may be painful. And that's the sinew. And that's the sinew that was touched and the sinew that was affected. What exactly? So let's try to elaborate on what the Rashbam is saying, and I think I'll make it a little practical. Everybody in this world is going to have certain challenges. We don't want us to challenge. We want to run away from the challenge. God sometimes pushes us toward the challenge, doesn't let us escape. That's the angel holding us down. We're going to get hurt by the challenge, perhaps. But what happens? What's the most interesting thing that happens after the challenge? In the morning, how does Jacob turn back and refer to that wrestling that he had all night with the angel? He says, so how does he look at that challenge? He says, Pnei El, this is the face of God. In other words, ironically, where do you feel the connection to God? When you have to push through and overcome the challenge that God sends you. Now, you don't want the challenge, but often when you overcome the challenge, that's when you find your deepest connection to God. And maybe that's why Jacob is saying, that's the mitzvah the Torah says. The mitzvah says, remember that Jacob's sinew was dislocated. remember that you're going to face challenges, but understand, like Jacob did, that that's where you see God, that's where you see Hashem. And that's the important message, because everybody's going to have challenges to one degree or another. Now let's think about this. Look at the book of Genesis. There's two mitzvot that we talk about that are sort of in the area of the body. You have circumcision, that represents the bond with God, and you have not eating the sinew. One way to think about it a little poetically, the circumcision represents the active desire to connect to God. The sinew represents the idea that I don't want challenge, I'm running away from challenge, but ultimately, that's another avenue to connect to God, where I overcome the challenge and I persevere. And I may be affected negatively, but the place where I ultimately will find God, first of all, because I have to dig deeper within myself and find deeper strength within myself to be able to overcome. And also because ultimately that's God's will and God's desire. So specifically in the space of where the struggle happens, that's where Jacob wakes up in the morning and he says, you know what? I've seen God. I've seen the power of God. And that's what we celebrate. So we celebrate, in other words, historically, it's we will survive, not unscathed. We had persecution, but we'll survive as a people and reach the morning, which means we'll overcome as a people and reach great, and we'll have a bright future. That's the historical perspective. The personal perspective is we have a challenge. We seek to run away. We can't run away. We're forced to face the challenge. And we understand, because of Jacob, that we understand that the dislocated hip, in other words, the fact that we're going to limp, the fact that we're facing some degree of challenge, is in fact the space where we connect to God in a very deep way. So that's the idea in a nutshell. We can elaborate it, but it's already 10:59, so we'll stop 1 minute early. And again, thank you all for joining. And comments or questions, if anybody has comments or questions, please share. Otherwise, have a wonderful day. And we had enough of the dislocated hip. Now we should have the morning and the healing, and only good things for us and everybody else around the world. So thank you.
Reaction. Rabbi,
ahead.
one
Go ahead.
very quick question. My
Yeah.
question is it significant that Jacob, who is reason, and Esau, who is the guy who goes out and hunts, who's passion, is it significant that in a sense, this wrestling with God has to be done not by Esau, because presumably God could have anybody set up to do that. But why specifically, in terms of Jacob's personality, in terms of him representing, the intellect or whatever, he needs to do the wrestling match. It's almost like saying they're a kid who's hyper intellectual needs to take karate lessons.
Right. So what I would say is like this. That's one interpretation of what you're saying. But I would say something, another way to think about it is that it says that Jacob was alone. And the question was, why was he alone? He was with his entire family. So you have a technical answer. He was helping everybody cross the river. And then he went back to cross the possessions, and he's going back and forth. And when he was on the other side of the river alone, that's where he was attacked and met and challenged by the stranger. That's the conventional interpretation. But the more mystical interpretation, more psychological, first time I saw it written was in the mid 1800s. It says like this: it's an internal battle. Jacob is alone, not because his wife is not around him, not because his children are not around him, because this battle represents an internal battle. And he has to deal with the Esav that's within himself. Before he can deal with his brother, he has to make peace with the tension within himself. Now, if you talk about the person who just runs after the passion, so he's the world of chaos and no order in his life, there's no problem. He does whatever he wants. He robs the banks, he goes and he hunts, does whatever he wants. There's no passion. But it's the person who's trying to become a little bit more spiritual, the person who's trying to live an enlightened life. That person inevitably is also going to encounter the chaotic parts within their soul, the dark side within their soul. So that person is going to struggle. And that person is going to, in some ways, try to escape it, right? Spiritual seekers, they try to ignore the negative side within themselves. So they try to run away from it. But the answer is don't run away from it, embrace it and channel it. And that's a very difficult struggle, but it's all happening within Esav. Meanwhile, the other guy, who's just the chaotic forces with no enlightenment at all, there's no chaos. Everything is fine. They're just running after their heart. There's no problems. Reminds me of a joke. We'll finish with the joke because it's very heavy. There was a chassid of the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, who's the founder of Chabad. This chassid was a great scholar, but he would always make jokes. He also make jokes. He was a happy person, made jokes, and his comedy was very deep. So one funny story is, I have no idea what the purpose of the story is. I don't know that there is a purpose, but I'm just going to say it because it's a funny story. So the story is that there was a big wedding between Rabbi Shneur Zalman's grandchild and his colleague, a great Hasidic Rabbi, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak Berditchev, and their grandchildren are getting married in the town of Zhlobin. Maybe Vicky can help us. I think it's on the map in Ukraine. So there's this great wedding, and everybody comes. All the students come to this wedding, and the ladies, they cook a beautiful kugel for Shabbos morning. So Friday night, the Hasidim are having a fabrengen, a Hasidic gathering, and they ran out of food. And they're saying, L'chaim, you need food, you need chasers throughout the nights. So they go into the kitchen and they see the beautiful kugel that was designated for Shabbos morning. They eat it on Friday night. The morning, the Rebbitzin comes into the kitchen and they see the kugel is gone. She makes an investigation. What happened? This guy, Shmuel Munkus, this guy took the kugel. So she says, I'm taking you to a din Torah. I'm taking you to a rabbinic court. So they go to her husband, Rabbi Shneur Zalman, and he says, look, we have a complaint. What's the complaint? He says, I worked the whole night. I worked the whole Friday, made a beautiful kugel for Shabbos afternoon for the lunch, for the Kiddush. And now the Hasidim, Shmuel Munkus, the Hasidim took the kugel and they ate it. Oh, that's a good claim. So he turns to Rabbi Shmuel Munkus and says, no, what's your complaint? He says, I have no complaints. The kugel was very good. That's the joke. The point here is that the person who's not struggling is not struggling. I don't know if that's the point of the story, but that's what it reminded me of. The person who's not struggling is not struggling. The person who's struggling, they're the person who's looking for enlightenment. They're the one that struggles, and then they're the one that is going to have to face their own inner Esav and ultimately make peace and make harmony and kiss and embrace, as we will see. There's a lot more to say about this, but enough for a beginning. So thank you all for joining. Wonderful day, and Shabbat Shalom.
Thank you.